Hey everybody, glad to be back with you all again. Today's video is about a game that didn't get a lot of attention when it first came out, and for obvious reasons, especially here in the US. Yes, Metal Gear Solid captured our attention and our hearts, but many people didn't know, or simply didn't care, that we also received a game with the same name on the Game Boy Color. Yes, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the game is some kind of a port of the PlayStation 1 classic, seeing the name is exactly the same here and all, but it is in fact a completely different story, and even set in an alternate timeline. In Europe and Japan, the game was titled Metal Gear Ghost Babel, which is what I would heavily prefer to call it here as well. So with all of that out of the way, how's the game? Strap in, and we'll see just how well Metal Gear Ghost Babel for the Game Boy Color holds up today. Released in April of 2000 for the Game Boy Color, Metal Gear Ghost Babel is a top-down action-adventure and stealth game, taking place in an alternate timeline, 7 years after the first Metal Gear. In this timeline, the events of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake and Metal Gear Solid for the PS1 never actually happened. Instead, we're given an all-new story with new characters, villains, and scenarios, despite some familiar faces as well. Heck, the intro sequence even parallels Colonel Campbell's encounter with Snake in the PlayStation 1 Metal Gear Solid. You also see Mei Ling return, as a partner and the person who saves your data. The story beats are also quite similar in some cases. In Ghost Babel, we learn of a group named the Gindra Liberation Front, or GLF, led by a man named General Augustine Egwabon, engaged in a civil war outside of Gindra, South Africa. Colonel Campbell advises Snake that this group kidnapped a prototype of a new kind of Metal Gear, and was planning to use it to win the war. He also tells Snake that the enemy's base location of Gallowade was originally Outer Heaven, the same place that Snake destroyed the original Metal Gear in the first game. This persuades Snake to come out of retirement once again. Snake is also joined by new characters like Weasel, an expert on data gathering, Brian McBride, a CIA agent who Snake is immediately skeptical of, and finally Chris Jenner, the sole survivor of her group in Delta Force. Before delving into the story more, let's talk about the game's presentation first. Wow, does this thing look beautiful, especially for a Game Boy Color game. If you had told me this was an early Game Boy Advance title, I might have even believed you. All of Snake's movements are fast and fluid, with some very stylish areas and cutscenes to follow. Sure, it's not as cinematic as its PS1 counterpart, obviously, but it sure is ambitious all the same. Instead of a straightforward story, the game is separated into 13 chapters to divide up the action, which you get ranks for. As you can see, this game is not afraid to tell me just how awesome I really am at it. For such a limited number of buttons, you're given a shocking amount of things to do and manage. On top of moving with the D-pad, punching with A, and shooting with B, you also duck and crawl with the start button, and open up a main menu with select. From here, you can switch out your items and weapons, and even call other characters on the codec. As you can see here, this setup is clearly trying to bridge together elements of Metal Gear, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and Metal Gear Solid all in one, and for the most part, it actually succeeds. You can even take cover behind walls and hit them to confuse your enemies, just like in the PS1 game. The former is mostly pointless, but it looks cool and becomes necessary for some puzzles the game throws at you later on. Speaking of puzzles, this game's chock full of them. You get everything from switch puzzles to Nikita missile guiding, and even one involving cardboard boxes on a conveyor belt where you have to switch to the right colored box in order to go in the proper direction. It was a little confusing as you have no ways of knowing which way is the correct one, leading to a lot of trial and error, but it didn't hold me back too long. The only puzzle I found to be a little annoying was the one involving the wall cover mechanic. I think this was due to the fact that you have to move so slowly the whole time, but I did find myself getting irked every time I went down the wrong path and had to go all the way back too. But like I said, for the most part, I found a lot of these puzzles to be pretty fun and creative. I wouldn't have minded seeing this kind of thing in other installments of the series. Still, this was a fun way to distinguish it from the other games all the same. It also wouldn't be a Metal Gear game without over-the-top boss fights, and this game has quite a few. You quickly learn about 4 members of the group Black Chamber, with the names Slasher Hawk, Marionette Owl, Pyro Bison, and last but not least, Black Arts Viper, their leader. This group allegedly swore revenge after being taken out by Foxhound. Yes, that Foxhound, which was under Roy Campbell's command at the time. Each fight is unique enough in its own regard. Slasher Hawk requires you to throw grenades across while dodging both his hawk and steel boomerangs, which he calls Wilgies. Marionette Owl forces you to wear night vision goggles just to see him, and dodge both of his marionettes, who each have their own attack patterns, all while trying to attack him and not get stunned by his flash grenades, which he throws way too often. I seriously won this fight by just shooting blindly. Pyro Bison reminded me a little of Vulcan Raven. You have a similar fight strategy where it's important to stay out of his line of sight so he won't hit you with his flamethrower. I enjoyed using the Nikita missiles and the assault rifle for this fight. Viper also proved to be pretty zany. His strategy was to run away from you and create walls of electricity all around the room, making you have to use those as a pathway to get within proper distance and fire. If I had to criticize anything, it would be that these characters don't feel very compelling, at least compared to other boss characters in the Metal Gear series, like Revolver Ocelot or Sniper Wolf, for example. Still, it's a lot more story than you would get from most action games of this type, and the characters do their job of moving the story along just fine. And this doesn't include other fights, like the one where you take on a helicopter piloted by a woman named Sophie Nadram, or of course Metal Gear itself, but we'll get to that last one in just a bit. Another staple of the Metal Gear games, especially from Metal Gear Solid onward, is the huge amount of plot twists we get along the way, and I can honestly say that this title is no exception. Just like in the previous games, we find out that Snake was left in the dark about a lot of details going into this mission. A lot of it revolves around something called Project Babel, an attempt to establish the United States as the sole superpower in Africa. Between the Colonel keeping information about Black Chamber a secret, like them being a United States unit in the first place, for example, Chris's real intention being to eliminate any evidence of Project Babel by assassinating General Augustine Eguibon, and Snake finding out that his entire mission was basically set up by a virtually unknown character named Steve Gardner, who we're barely even told anything about, things get pretty hairy as the story progresses. It all comes to a head in the final few chapters when Snake reaches Metal Gear in the underground maintenance base, in order to prevent a nuclear strike from taking place. The fight with Metal Gear itself proved to be very creative and strategic. I'd go as far as to say I enjoyed this fight more than the one in the PS1 Metal Gear Solid. No, seriously. Before even getting a chance to fire at it, you have to run away until it attempts to step on you, forcing you to either use C4 or landmines to damage it. Once it's finally taken care of, the second and main phase of the fight begins. Here, Snake has to destroy 2 machine guns in the front, 2 gun posts behind it, and 2 missile launchers in the back. The fight requires you to stay moving constantly while throwing grenades or using Nikita missiles. Hitting the guns in the front is easy enough, but the posts behind them require you to throw grenades diagonally, and may take a few tries to get right. Once Metal Gear gets a little weaker, missiles begin to launch from the back, and you now have to dodge these while continuing the same kind of onslaught as before. They do not give you a lot of room to avoid these though, and they cause a huge amount of damage if you get hit by one. After Metal Gear's down to its last bit of health, it begins shooting flames from its mouth in all directions. I admit, I ran out of grenades multiple times by this point, so I was grateful to see that more appear when you do. Phew! Once that's all over, General Eguibon finally explains his role in this, and even admits that he too was a pawn in this setup by John Parker, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, but that he only went along with him for his own means. This was, of course, also set up by Steve Gardner, the mystery man himself. After Snake receives all of the data he needs to find the orchestrators of this entire incident, Viper returns for one final battle. While it's not nearly as hard as the first time you fought, you're only given a minute and a half to take him down. For some reason, this battle reminded me of the one with Liquid Snake in the PS1 Metal Gear Solid, perhaps due to Viper constantly shouting things at me between hits. After this fight's completed, the nuclear strike is finally stopped, and Chris arrives with a jeep for her and Snake to get away in. During their conversation, Snake reveals he only went to Outer Heaven for the purpose of dying, due to being afraid of who he, as a person, truly was outside of this constant war and conflict. He then reveals that he intends to go back to the US and track down both Parker and Gardner, and put a stop to them, despite knowing that Foxhound will be there, waiting. And that's it, unfortunately. Outside of a few Easter eggs in the other Metal Gear titles, this story was never to be completed. The game's director, Shinta Nojiri, also directed the 2 Metal Gear Acid games for the PlayStation Portable, but they too were different stories with no connection to this one. It's honestly a shame, as I was really looking forward to seeing where all of this would go. But don't think for a second that you'll run out of things to do so quickly. The game also has VR missions just like the PS1 Metal Gear Solid. Over 180 of them, in fact, with choices between practice and time attack modes. Still not enough? After you beat the game, you're given a special mode where you play as a mysterious character communicating with a person simply known as Number 4. These missions have you replaying segments from the original 13 stages, albeit with different objectives. Even more interesting, once you complete the stages, you're told that the person participating in the training is named Jack. If it's the Jack we're all thinking of, then that would make this the first official reference to the character Raiden, who would go on to appear in Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. Now keep in mind this is all part of an alternate timeline once again, so it still wouldn't be canon to the main story, but wow, all the same. Oh, and I didn't get to try this out, but the game even has a versus mode. Yes, seriously. With a link cable, you and a friend can compete against each other in missions to shoot down drones, get their data, and reach the end goal first. Still, even with the incomplete story, this game, as a whole, was shockingly good. It managed to incorporate elements both old and new at the time, and make a gameplay system that would be surprisingly functional. The one major gameplay flaw I've found is the amount of buttons you need to press in order to switch between weapons and items. Had this title come out for the Game Boy Advance, we may have seen some incorporation with the GBA's L and R shoulder buttons, but alas, it was not meant to be. That said, I can't blame the developers for not using buttons that didn't exist yet. It's just something to be aware of. Putting it all together, this game is something of a technical marvel. On top of the long and detailed story and surprisingly functional control scheme, you're given a host of other modes to play and occupy you for hours on end. I'm still in shock that something this massive could even exist on a cartridge so tiny. And it's rated E for everyone. I have no idea why that is, but that's cool. If you're a fan of the Metal Gear series, or even if you're just thinking about trying it for the first time, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by this one like I was. It may be a small game on a small handheld, but it does a great job of making you feel like it's something huge all the same. Little cartridge, big heart. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played this game before yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you all again real soon.